It's Tuesday, February 22nd, 2000, and it's my pleasure to be with Steven Phillips, a 1971 graduate of the University of Arizona College of Law. My name is Vicki Fleischer, and I'm here to ask you some questions, Mr. Phillips. Thanks for meeting with us.
Well, good morning, Vicki. How are you?
Very good, thank you. Can you tell us why you decided to go to law school?
Well, that's an interesting question. Actually, I decided to go to law school because I didn't know what else to do. It was in the Vietnam War. And I actually, in the mid-'60s, I began to think about going to law school. And I recognized that it was going to be a difficult thing to get into because I had only been getting A's in PE. I was a jock my first 2 years of college, and after my second year, when I didn't, my times didn't improve, I realized that I really needed to become a student rather than an athlete. So I switched to the University of Arizona, and it was at that point I really started wanting to become a lawyer.
Mm-hmm. Why did you go to the University of Arizona College of Law?
Well, to be candid, I had a lot of trouble getting in after my first 2 years of very poor grades. They weren't poor, they just weren't very good. And I did have some A's in PE, and I had some A's in some other subjects like accounting and economics and things that sort of encouraged me. But I also didn't do well on the outside. So, and I was an Arizona resident, and I would never have considered going to ASU, so that left me really one choice, and ultimately that's where I did end up.
Great. How many students were in your class when you began?
There were 103 in my class to begin with. I think we graduated less than 60. I think it was 59 or something. Vietnam War, a little attrition. This was the second class of Dean Ayers who was more selective in his process. Mm-hmm. So we didn't lose as many as a few years before, but we still lost a few just by way of attrition and also by way of the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm. Tell me a little bit about how the war affected the law school.
Well, I remember a couple things in particular. One, of course, was the number of people who I think applied, because just before the late 60s, I graduated in 1968, there was still a deferment for law students. By the time I graduated in 1968, until offensive, the deferment for law schools was gone. And so a lot of people joined the National Guard and reserve units and that sort of thing. So I think that had an impact. There was certainly a polarization of students. There were a handful of very conservative students who were in favor of the war, and there was sort of a vast majority who were against it, but not strongly. Didn't protest, didn't march, didn't have a lot of dialogue about it. But there was a serious group that did, a sort of the middle group, who did not believe that we were supposed to be there, but on the other hand, didn't actively protest.
Mm-hmm. What was campus like during that time?
Well, it was not a very large campus at that point. It was probably in the 22,000 range, probably closer to 20. And our law school was over in what's called the Franklin Building now, over on the south side of campus, dirt parking lots and that sort of thing. Kind of a sleepy town, kind of a sleepy campus. Kind of woke up in the late 60s with a lot more civil rights activists, particularly with issues involving civil and black civil rights, and also with respect to the war in Vietnam. There were marches, and there were more vocal advocates against the war in the undergraduate school at that point.
I've seen a picture of main campus with the rally going on. You said there were a few students who were real vocal about it, but not the majority.
Right, in the law school.
Yeah, right.
And they were more in the first year class, I believe, than in the third year class and the second year class. It seemed like my class was a much more active kind of a advocate for and against, and mostly were against. Few were in favor.
Did that lead to some clashes in the classroom with those, polarized views?
To some extent. I recall one professor, Brown, who was very conservative and very, I'll say he was pro-war, is probably a little bit too much. I happen to like Claude. I taught with him later, enjoyed him, but he was rather vocal about his point of view, and one of his favorite comments was to say that so-and-so took the shortest route to Washington, he went to Harvard and turned left. And which was perhaps somewhat true, I don't know, but he was an interesting fellow who taught evidence, and he would not tolerate anybody getting up in class and announcing any kind of a demonstration. I recall one time when friend of mine, Fred Ludy, who's now deceased, got up at the end of class to announce that there was going to be some kind of a rally or something, and Professor Brown was upset about that, and not in my classroom, and Fred ignored him. I don't know if Fred got a very good grade or not, and I'm not suggesting that Claude he was a tough grader, but he was an impartial grader.
Yeah.
I did not do real well in this class. Didn't get an A, but
Were your classmates mainly from Arizona?
well, I think probably the majority were, and the majority had probably gone to the University of Arizona, but there were a fairly, well, I'd say probably 20%, that's just a guess, that were out-of-state students who came, from who not only were from other states, but had gone to college in other states. We had a lot of people from other states, but they had gone to the University of Arizona graduate school, so it's continued on here.
Mm-hmm. What was the average age of your classmates?
It's pretty young. I would suspect it was probably in the low 20s. I was 22, and I know my friend Fred Luby, for example, was about 25, 26. He had left the university and gone into the service and come back. And we had a few people who dropped from the class in front of us to our class because they had a commitment for the service, and they went away to active duty for 6 months and came back and they're in our class.
Mm-hmm. How many women were in the class?
It was probably about 6. It was very, there weren't very many. And I think probably only about 2 or 3 graduated. I still see some of them occasionally. Well, actually, maybe there were more than that, because we had a fairly famous student, her name was Barbara Elkbrand, who had been involved in the Arizona loyalty oath issue with the U.S. Supreme Court. Her and her husband, and after that and she was a very soft-spoken Quaker person. And I didn't know her real well, but I certainly knew her. And there were some older. The women tended to be a little older. I remember a woman named Virginia Howard, she was probably 40, but she was older than the rest of us. So.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some older male students too.
Were there a lot of minority students?
We had a few, mainly because Chuck Ayers had been very active in attempting to bring minorities into the law school. So we had a few Hispanic. We did not have any black, male or female in our class.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a pretty waspy group.
Mm-hmm. Any Native American students that you remember?
Not in our class. I think the class ahead of us had 1 or 2.
Were you involved with the law review?
Yes, and that's kind of a funny, interesting, well, it's anecdotal in the sense that of the class, there were only 5 or 6 on the large, small. There's a few of us that are alive. I run into one friend occasionally, I don't see him too often, George Fulner, who comments to me, well, good to see you, because I don't know how many of us are still alive. I know of at least 3 that passed, 4 that passed away. Well, 3. One I'm not sure of. I've tried to find him. His name was Fritz Harlow. He was in Vermont, and I belong to a group of national lawyers, and I occasionally ask people that I meet from Vermont if they know Fritz, and people knew him, but they said, yeah, I don't know whether he's retired, but I can't seem to find him. So, but it's taken its toll very quickly on the 5 or so people, 6, I guess, 7 is the number of the editors.
Was there summer school when you were there?
Yes, it was. As a matter of fact, one of my fairly good friends in law school, Dan Cabot, came to summer school in between our first and second year, I guess, and then came back between second and third from the University of Georgia, and transferred in and graduated with us. And I did not take summer school. I took both summers, but I was fairly active. People who were trying to either graduate 2.5 years, a couple friends did, or who were trying to catch up would take the summer school. But I think it was only 1 session.
Were there any clinical programs at that time?
Just beginning. I recall, in fact, that was the new rage. Empirical data research was making its way, I think, into the law reviews and scholarly writing at that point. And Professor Wexler, I believe, taught a course, and I think that's when Andy Silverman first came back. It might have been a little later because I taught at the law school later, so I'm kind of some of those things run together. But I do recall that David and I think there was somebody else, maybe Kenny, but I think he came a little later as well to run some clinical programs. But they had sort of begun under another professor named Graham, James Graham, who unfortunately passed away early 70s. But he had come from somewhere in the Northeast, and he had a civil right, not a civil rights, but a law of poverty kind of a program he got students involved in.
What type of student activities were there when you were in law school?
Well, there was, of course, moot court and the law review, and we did have a football game with the ASU Law School one point. I don't remember who won that game, and it was sort of unimportant, but it was sort of fun. There were two legal fraternities, not extremely active, I don't believe. And there were parties, but they were informal. We did get some attendance by the professors in those days. Were sort of two groups. There was an older group, and there was a much younger group. Names that will now sound old: Woods and Andrews and Wexler and Boyd and Joel. What's Joel's last name? I remember his last name. He'd come here in my third year. But they were young Turks at that point, and were making their mark in the teaching world, and some of the older ones were friendly to them, and some were not. There seemed to be a little bit of polarization between older faculty members and the younger ones.
Were there any married students in your class?
Yeah, quite a few. I was one of the married students, and there were probably, I would guess, half the class. A lot of them, right after graduation had gotten married and come to law school. I lived out at Christopher City, and there were a number of law students in the second and third year class who lived out there as well. So that we would, although there wasn't much activity out there that I engaged in because I was so busy at the law school. So.
Right. What were the job prospects like when you graduated?
Well, they were actually pretty good, but they were mostly Arizona firms. We had a few who came from other states. There were, for some reason, it was a Milwaukee firm that used to show up pretty regularly and hired people out of the class, ahead of us at least. I ended up going to Los Angeles when a firm interviewed at the law school. There was probably 3 or 4 LA firms, and there were, most of them were Phoenix firms and some Tucson firms. And then the Department of Justice and those sort of.
So you took the California bar then?
Yes, and I took both of them that summer because it was the last non-multi-state. So I took the bar in Arizona in July, and then I took the California bar in late August. And it was a good refresher for the California bar because it was more, it had a lot more questions, but they were shorter. I had a real interesting experience when I took the Arizona bar. I was given at the law school, and I had flown back to take it. And I had 2 typewriters and not much else in way of clothing. But two little short stories. One was there was a question on the first session. As I recall, there were supposed to be 5 sets or something, and you could take your time, and you could take 3 hours to do one set, or you could take 20 minutes. And I had finished. It was a really kind of interesting, quote unquote, interesting tax question, which I got sort of involved in. Finished it, went upstairs to get a drink of water, and I ran into Professor Andrews, and he said, "Well, are you coming?" And I said, "Well, I'm half through." And he looked at the clock and said, "You want to get 2.5 hours to finish the other half." So I ran downstairs and I got busy. But fortunately, there were some easier questions on the second part. The last part was, this is the beginning of the time when they first started security at airports, and it was not a real, they didn't have metal detectors and all that sort of thing, but they tried to quote unquote profile people. Well, I had, after the bar had finished on Saturday, I had gone to the Bay Horse with some friends, and we had a few beers, and I went over to my friend George Fulner's house for dinner, and I had an airplane ride back that evening, and so I had gotten out to the airport, and I hadn't shaved in probably 3 or 4 days, and I had 2 typewriters with some clothes stuffed in. I looked a little bit suspicious, I suspect, because they wanted to go through and they looked at these 2 typewriters and thought, what in the world's that? One's electric and one's manual. So I said, well, I just took the bar exam, and if the power went out, I had to have a backup.
Smart. Tell me about some of your favorite subjects at the law school.
Well, I was very enthralled with code courses. When I went to law school, I wanted to be a trial person, as I think probably everybody did or does, I suppose. It was after my first year, which I enjoyed, but not immensely, not to the point where I thought, gee, this is my lifelong calling. In the second year, I took Professor Boyd in Uniform Commercial Code, and really enjoyed it. I had him for constitutional law in the first semester, or probably second semester, first year, and did not particularly like his way of teaching at that point. Recognized later, because I was inept in the subject, when we got into something that I was more in tune with, then it became obvious he was a very good teacher, and then he challenged you to really think about what it was. He assumed you came to class knowing the base material, and now we're going to go out and look at what it really means and how it all interrelates to each other. So when I finally took Arthur's class in income tax and sat in the front row, and there was a fellow in the second year, actually he was a third year student at that point, who had dropped back to our class because of the Army. His name was Jim. I can't remember his last name now, it's ridiculous. We called him Augie. But he graduated number 1 in the class ahead of us because he got 18 units of A when he was trying to catch back up to his class. But he had to take income tax. And so he was in the first couple of classes sitting in the back, but I was bantering with Arthur, so he came up, sat by me, and we used to sit there, and he'd say, I don't understand this, and then he would proceed to ask questions, and it was clear he really did understand it. But that was a very fabulous course. I really did enjoy it. And Arthur got through so much tax, and that's when I really knew that that's what I wanted to do. That this was the area of the law that was the most exciting. Another one that was very good was Rex Lee, who was Solicitor General under Ronald Reagan. Taught a course down here as a young lawyer in Phoenix, and he would drive down on a Tuesday, as I recall, Tuesday or Thursday, I guess it was Thursday. And there was only second and third year students, and there was perhaps maybe 15 students, and it was antitrust, and it was a whole year course, and it was I would sit in there sometimes because it wasn't just the cases, it was the economic analysis of why this particular case, what was the foundation of the problem, the anti-competitive effect of this. So it was a theory of the firm. I'd been really interested in economics. I did a lot of economics in the graduate school, so it was just great. I was sitting there sometimes, and these people would get into these arguments, and I would only halfway understand about half the time. But it was a very good experience, and a couple of people ended up being antitrust lawyers later on. So it was a very, very wonderful course.
That was interesting. How many classes did you usually take each semester?
Well, it seemed like there were like 4, 4 or 5. I think mostly they were, some were 5-unit courses or 4-unit courses, like as I recall. Tax was 4, and UCC was 4, and then a lot of them were 3, but like conflicts of law was 2, and that was a very good course too. I enjoyed Spade Barnes immensely. He was an older fellow, but he had a wonderful wit, and he had a wonderful method of calling on people, and then we used to get into competitions with each other to see who could respond more each class. And one day we were having a pretty good tussle at it, and I don't recall who won, but there was somebody, myself or another person was ahead, and it looked like who it was me or him was going to win, and then all of a sudden 2 quick questions came up because I think Spate knew what was going on, and it turned to whoever ended up winning. So.
What was your homework like? Was it reading? Was there papers assigned?
Well, because we didn't have computers, papers were assigned mainly and we cut and pasted them. The law review did the same. There was another aside. I did a lot of work in the law libraries. There was a little alcove over in the old law school, and a lot of my friends didn't even know it was there. But you could type it inside the library, because it was a little table up there, and it was 2 or 3 students that would go up there every day and we'd cut and paste. And I mean, literally take a pair of scissors out and cut these drafts up and paste them on with the magic tape, because you could write on magic tape. And I remember the first draft that I wrote, and he just died, unfortunately. A fellow named Lex Smith was my editor, and I had used regular Scotch tape, and he was really upset because you couldn't write on it. But the homework was a lot more. We would begin doing outlines. It was reading, and we didn't brief cases anymore after at least the first semester. I didn't, but with copious notes, and then try to put them into an outline form to understand them. But it was more of that type than papers. There was one, the starred seminars, we called it when I taught here, became different, and that was more to give more people the writing experience. But the law review took a lot of time, and that was part of the education for me, was to learn really legal writing.
Mm-hmm. What were your exams like?
They were, I think, in fact, the joke around the law school at that time was that Arthur asked to give a 6-hour exam, and they wouldn't allow him to do that, and so he gave the same exam, and just gave him 4 hours. But they were 3 or 4 hours, and they were essay, and fortunately they allowed us to type. So in what was the old courtroom over at the old law school, we would sit in there, and the typers were in there, and there was another typing room. And the other persons, you could go any place in the law school and write in the blue books. But they tended to be essay. I don't recall any courses that I took that were multiple choice. Mm-hmm. Professor Hoffman did have an oral exam, and that was, I'm told, I didn't take that course with him, I'm told that was a very difficult exam. You'd get in there, he would begin to grill you, and it would move from one to another, and so you didn't know what the direction was going.
Sounds like arguing a case before the appellate court or something. What was your graduation ceremony like?
Well, we had 2. One, of course, with the regular part of the university in the Arizona Stadium, but we had a separate one at Gallagher Theater, and that's my only real connection to Gallagher, because I didn't spend much time there. It was built while I was in law school. But we did have a nice kind of a ceremony in late May 1971, and attended by families and friends and stuff. And then there was the nighttime regular university commencement, which was like in the evening. Law school students all sat together, the ones who went through with their cap and gown. I remember the buzz was from the 3rd year class behind of us said, "Ooh, wow, let's go through it because you get to wear doctoral robes."
Do you know whether your professors were required to publish as they are now?
Well, I think they were because of the for tenure. Mm-hmm. I know that Professor Andrews, the tenure piece that he wrote, and I was involved in it in a very small way. There was another law professor here from the University of Florida by the name of Freeland, James Freeland, who was a very well-known, still is a tax professor, and had been at NYU when Chuck had taught at NYU. And so this is one that I have such respect for Charles, even though he would always say, "John, I have a clue what you guys are talking about in there and really don't want to know." But he was very careful to bring in very, very good people. It almost got Freeland to stay here at the law school. And ultimately, he started a graduate tax program at the University of Florida, which is a very fine program. But the 2 of them became pals, and they wrote an article together on the capital gains changes of the 1969 Tax Reform Act. And he decided in our 3rd year that they would hire myself and another student to be their researchers. And I think we got $2 an hour or something, probably was in excess of minimum wage. But it was something that we had to do anyway because it was going to be published in our law review. So we got paid for, in effect, doing the research on some issues involving this thing. And so I recall that as that was the first I had recognized that professors needed to do something beyond teaching. Mm-hmm. And so I know that they had requirements, and that was Arthur's piece to, I believe, the beginning of it at least, for his tenure.
Mm-hmm. How many faculty members were there?
Well, I'm gonna guess, but there were probably 12, 15, so not very many. Um,
Were they accessible outside the classroom?
By and large, most of them were very accessible. I think the older ones, if there was a lot of fear factor. There were a lot of funny stories about Professor Brown. He was known as the Fox because if you were taking an exam, you thought you understood the question, and you didn't. And so the story was that one day somebody had told us, another student, that about this, and as he was just finishing up at his locker, and he turned to leave, and Professor Brown and another one came up, Professor Smith, I think it was. They were sort of friends. And, hello, Professor Smith, and hello, Professor Fox. And to which Brown looked at him, knew that nickname was out there, but I think they were accessible, and I say that because later on I watched closer at their behavior, and I saw that they were to students. I think we thought they weren't. Because we were afraid of them, and I was. But I wasn't of the younger ones, Woods, and well, it was at the beginning. I was afraid of them all. But in toward the second and third year, Brown, Boyd, and Andrews, and Woods, and the younger ones were all very accessible.
Do you know how one became a law professor at that time?
Well, I was recruited really by Arthur after I got out of law school, so I think a lot of that, at least at that point, seemed to be sort of who do you know, rather than broad searches. They seemed to, if you had a friend on it, it was a faculty member, you would ask what was up and when they might be looking for somebody, and at least that was my experience when I was hired.
So tell me a little bit about what it was like to be a professor where you went to law school.
Well, it was interesting because all the students, of course, were changed by then. They were none of the people that I had gone to law school were still in law school, which was good. It was 4 years later. And I was not much older than them, although I thought I was. I recognize now when I see people who were in that first class, they're about the same age as I am, and I'm sure it was kind of an interesting experience for them too, because I didn't have a vast amount of practical experience. I had practiced for 4 years, but I thought I knew a lot of stuff. And, it's all relative, I suppose. But it was a different experience, and I got to teach two of the courses I really wanted to teach, which was income tax and business planning. I ended up teaching a bankruptcy course with a professor, actually with an adjunct, Bob Lesher, who I have a lot of respect for, and he had been one of my teachers, and he would have been a fine professor if that's all he had done. He was very good. I'm not suggesting he wasn't, but I didn't enjoy the course very much because it was not one of mine. And they changed the bankruptcy code shortly thereafter, and I just quickly lost any knowledge of what I had known before 1978.
Yeah. So you're a practicing lawyer now. What brought you back out of academia to practice?
I missed my clients. Interestingly, Arthur still doesn't believe that I did that, mainly because teaching jobs are very, very difficult to get. But I really did miss the world. I missed being on the street when what we read about, at least in the tax area, is not what is in the book, but rather what's on the street. And what's in the street is the clients and the problems that make up the real world. And I missed that part of it. And so after really a year, I knew that while it would be a good sojourn for me, I really wanted to get back into practice and to really consider I was going to go back to Los Angeles, and got interested in staying here from a couple friends, and ultimately, I guess I'm glad I did. I have good friends that are still practicing in LA, and haven't enjoyed it nearly as much as I have, I don't think. Some of them have. The person who recruited me to Los Angeles, I talked to him a couple of weeks ago. My little firm in Los Angeles has remained close. There's one in Phoenix, there's one in San Diego, there's one in Aspen, Colorado, and then there's me, and the rest of them are in Los Angeles, or in, I guess a couple of them are up in Santa Barbara, in LA Basin. And we remain pretty close. I talk to at least one of them within every 6 months. We have reunions occasionally when somebody retires or dies. Last summer, one of the older fellows died, or one of the older fellows, and we went out and saw all the people, and it was just it was heartwarming to see everybody. those circumstances, because that was, gosh, 29 years ago, or 30 years ago, 29, can't count. But it was a very, it was a good experience to practice in LA. I just didn't like living in that city. So.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned some of the professors that you enjoyed. Tell me a little bit about Dean Ayers and how he interacted with the students and a little bit of what he did to change the school.
Well, I have the most respect for him for a lot of reasons. One of them is he is a very selfless person. I mean, the man could have been an incredible lawyer. I'm sure he was a very good lawyer when he practiced. Could have made tons of money. It was not his interest. And what I remember him the first day in class was, first of all, he was very nattily dressed. He had a blue blazer and a red tie, and he was sort of black and the salt and pepper hair. And I was so afraid of him because that he would call on me and ask me a question. And I years later saw that movie, The Paper Chase, and Timothy Bottoms is telling his girlfriend that there are 3 groups in the class and that he's really in the middle part. He wants to get to the top, and then he has the experience of being called on and just, he really baffles everybody. Well, I had that experience too, except that it was a bit, I don't recall exactly, but I do remember that the question, it was kind of like, well, what's today? And I said, well, it's Tuesday. And it was Wednesday or something. It was just, it was a stupid answer and I didn't get it right. But it was, I remember he and Woody, Winton Woods, taught an introduction to law and civil procedure. And it was a frightening course because they were talking about things I had no clue, and people would come to class and I had no idea what they were talking about. I mean, it was these, in the beginning, the 6 causes, forms of action: trover, trespass on the case, conversion, whatever. I can't remember all of them now. But I remember one of the students, who didn't turn out to be a great student, but he came and he was talking about something, and I was just flabbergasted because I had read all the stuff. It was like 4 pages, but I couldn't understand it. I understood later what happened is they were doing extracurricular work. They were going to the library. They were reading extra things, and I was just reading the case book. So I was really at a disadvantage. And I would just go home and say to myself, "Wonder why these people are getting all that stuff." But it was an experience of leading and understanding that you have to really think about these things. And I remember one particular class when there was a case that was cited, and he said to somebody in the class, "Well, now, what do you think that case is about?" And I think the name of the case was Pennington versus Pennington, but it was a divorce case. Mm-hmm. And I hadn't picked up on that, and I don't know, the person called on didn't either, but he was saying, well, there are some very difficult questions, particularly in that area, having to do with jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. And so it was a jurisdictional case. So I remember thinking, gee, that's interesting, you got to really think about these things. The other thing that I know and really respect about Chuck was his real willingness to take heat from the students, from the faculty, from the administration, to really build this law school, to really turn it from a fairly sleepy place. And I'm not degrading Professor Dean Lyons, because he had done a good job and it had a good reputation, but it has changed, and we are really, I believe, reaping the fruits of what Chuck did in the mid-60s. He came here and he became an elitist, or so the claim was. He wasn't. He was very accessible, and he was a guy that really believed not in the curve. You have to. There are certain things in life that are standards, and we've got to live up to them. And if you don't meet it, then if you all meet it, you're going to go get A's, and if you don't, then you're going to cut it down. I had the fortune to watch him at a faculty meeting one day, off the cuff, make a 10-minute statement in rebuttal to another professor, and it was unbelievable how. I thought, this guy just has different thought processes than I do. Because I was thinking, this was not right what the person was saying, but Chuck just, in a non-combative way, basically, made about 4 or 5 points that were just. He was no longer the dean, but I thought, that is a guy that he commands a lot of respect, and that's why I believe he, and it really is too bad he had the politics that he did. It should have been the U.S. Judge Springfield.
Tell me a little bit about the Franklin building where you went to school.
Well, it was a rather, first they had very poor library facilities. We had books stacked everywhere. Tom Tormey was the librarian. He was a wonderful fellow. He'd go in his office and he had just had books everywhere. And there were carrels up in the second, I don't know what that mezzanine floor was. And I mean, there was just no place to really study in the library because there were so many books that we just didn't have room for them. But the lecture halls were, I thought, quite good because they stepped down. They were all large, there were 3 of them. And I guess the largest one was on the south side of the building and two on the north side. And then smaller classrooms upstairs, there was some conference room and some other things. But it was intimate because that one central little hallway, you had to mingle with people out there, and the lockers were all out there, and it just, there was a lot of camaraderie among the students, although there was a lot of competition among students, particularly in the first year, everybody trying to jockey for position. But it was an okay building. I think it was probably inadequate when it was built in the late 50s. So by the time I got there in the late 60s, it was better because the classes were smaller. The third year class was probably in excess of 200. The first year class was probably less than 100, and we were 103 or something. So it had, I think they got a little larger after that, but it wasn't as bad as I suspect it was in the early 60s when they would probably have 300 in the first year class and 2 in the second, 1 in the third. So.
I want to ask you if you remember a woman named Mary Doyle, who was the first woman law professor.
Yes, Mary was here a couple years before me, and I tried to talk to her. She now is the dean of the University of Miami. I was at the University of Miami Institute last year, not this year too, but she didn't. She gave the introductory speech, and I was sitting in the front row, and I was trying to catch her attention, but then it went right into the session, and she's at Coral Gables, which is a ways away from Miami Beach, which is where the thing was. But I do remember Mary very much, and she was a good teacher and a nice person. I got to know her fairly well because I think she'd started a year or 2 before me, and so she was still fairly new when I arrived here.
Okay, I have some thought-provoking questions for you now. If you could give a defining characteristic of the U of A Law School, what would it be?
Well, I think that I would characterize it as a law school which has tried to better itself, to not only, I think it recognized that the key to becoming a better law school was through 2 things. One, better faculty, a little more active faculty, but more importantly, students. Students that were diverse, not only in their geographic locations, but in their ethnic backgrounds and in their backgrounds from other educational institutions. So I think and I think it's intent on becoming practical. I think there's been a big push. I have classmates who don't think this is true. They believe they didn't really learn to practice law. Well, I don't think that's the job of a law school, is to teach you to practice law. It is not really a guild, what we do. And I think there are people who were really good law students who were not good lawyers, and I think there were people who were not particularly good law students who have been very great lawyers. And so I have a classmate who wanted to be in the top part of the class, was not, but I think he is a fine lawyer, and I would hesitate under any circumstances to have him represent me. But I think it has been bent upon to look at the practical side. I think that's good because of the fact that there's a need to give students a reality check that this is a world that we live in, but at the same time keeping the theoretical and the real hard legal research and writing as a core part of it.
So if you were going to change one thing about legal education, what would you change?
Oh, That's a really difficult question. I don't know, because since I'm not involved with the law school, anymore on that part of it, although I have a pretty good friend who's now teaching, because he always wanted to, and he's been, since Professor Asher left, he's been doing the gift and estate. And I guess, I don't know. There was a little apathy in my third year class. I guess what I could change is, if I could change their attitude. I mean, some people just decided that it wasn't worth working at, and I think they regretted it later on, because I think there is. And I had a run-in, if you will, towards my third year with a couple of other students, one in particular, which was very disconcerting at the time. It was over some issues on the law review. Later on, though, as I look back on it, it was exciting because there was all this tension, and I don't mean that but it was a learning experience. I learned from it. I look back on it, and I disliked this guy very immensely afterwards. But then I began to look at things from his point of view, and I won't get into details, but I saw this person from a different perspective and recognized that he learned, I learned, and that this is really what we were supposed to do in law school. It wasn't just learning how to read a book or how to argue a case. It was really learning about life and the give and take of a society. So I guess if I could change one thing, I suppose, and I have no idea whether this is true today, but I would change the apathy. Now that's pretty difficult to do, because when people become apathetic, it's but a slap in the head. I don't mean physically, but wake up. You're going to regret this. This is a life to learn, not to waste.
So if you could convey a message to future law students, what would that message be?
I would say make the most of it, because it was the most fun, interesting, difficult time of my life. The struggle was when the fun was, as I look back. It was difficult, and I would get so angry reading these cases, and I would read these things, and I'd say to myself, this guy doesn't have a clue what's going on. And I would sometimes just rip it out of the book. Then I'd have to paste it back, because I couldn't go to class if I didn't have pages in the book. And I think what I got out of that was, gosh, it was fun. And I'd love to do it again. Not now, but I would like to go back and not change a thing. Just go back and live it, because I couldn't change anything that went on in that 3-year period. But it was the most eye-opening experience for me.
What would you like to see the law school accomplish in the future?
Well, I think to stay on the course that it's on, not to bow to the pressures of the legislature, and not to, I think I happen to believe that this central administration in the university is one of the best we've had since Harville. I think Harville was a benevolent dictator here during his reign, but he meant well. He brought things, particularly to the law school. I know we made great strides in the one or two, in particular the one after Harville, but I didn't like his autocratic style. But I think we need to recognize what our role is, that in a great research university, that we have a great part of it. And I think this seed money from Jim Rogers is a wonderful opportunity, and I don't think we ought to become complacent with it. I think we need to exploit that. I mean, we need to bring in more diversity among students and bring in both sides of this. I happen to be sort of a liberal person, but I would love to see us end up with somebody like Chief Justice Rehnquist here as a visiting professor. Just because I think we need that other point of view. We need to hear what the other side has to say.
Is there anything else you'd like to add that I haven't asked you about?
Well, I think this is a neat project. I'm glad you're doing this. I think it brings some kind of older people back, and I don't know who else you're going to interview, but I assume you must be having kind of a cross-section of students from across the years, and I frankly would like to see the tape when it's finished.
Great. Well, we will certainly do that. Thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you, Vicki.